This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 599 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The NFL schedule has made me change the Late Round Podcast schedule. Typically on Tuesday morning, you'd be able to listen to a 15 Transactions episode. But with games happening on Tuesday, it makes way more sense for me to drop the 15 Transactions episode on Wednesday morning. That way we can work with as much information as possible. Waivers are pushed back a day this week anyway. So today, we'll talk 10 trends. I have less complete data to work with this week, but there should be enough to make it an interesting show. Now, before getting to the trends, I want to remind you about the FanDuel NFL High-Low, a free-to-play fantasy football contest. All you have to do is build your scorecard with the teams that you think will score highest or lowest in 4 stat categories. The closer you are to being spot on, the more points you'll get. Players with the most points each week split the prize pool, and a perfect scorecard will win the jackpot. Head over to FanDuel.com today and play the FanDuel High-Low for free. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Trend 1 this week is about how insanely awful Week 15 really was. On Sunday, so this doesn't count games that are played on any other day, but on Sunday, we saw 40 offensive touchdowns. According to NFL Media's research department, that was the lowest total the NFL has seen on a Sunday where at least 10 games were played since 1994. Now, I'm recording this before the week is over, but through Sunday's games, we had just one 300-yard passer. For some context, week 1 of the season had 11 of those passers. If it felt like your amazing fantasy football team got crushed by nobodies in week 15, it's because it probably did. When most offenses aren't generating points, the players on those offenses fail. So it's sort of an equalizer. And it also makes the big performances like the ones from Gabriel Davis or Mark Andrews or the ones from Chiefs players, it makes those performances even more important, even more impactful. Because it's hard to come back from them with such little offense across the league. I can confidently say that it was the worst fantasy football week of my entire career. It was so frustrating. I've been playing fantasy for 20 years and I've been analyzing it for 9. I don't remember a single week like this one, let alone when the stakes were so high. Dak Prescott has finished as a QB2 or worse in weekly scoring in 4 of his last 5 games played. During this 5-game stretch, he's averaging just 11.9 fantasy points per game. One of the things that's apparent with Prescott over this time frame is that he hasn't been converting on his deep and intermediate throws. From weeks 1 through 10, so his games out of this split, Prescott was throwing at 15 or more air yards and a little over 16% of his attempts. Over the last 5 weeks, that number has been basically the same. It's up by 0.4%. The difference is how he's converted on those passes. During his first 8 games, or weeks 1 through 10, his completion rate on those throws was 47.8%. Over his last 5, that's dropped all the way to 29.4%. I'd argue that this should get better just because the 29% rate is that bad. He's been hitting his intermediate and deep passes at the same rate that Sam Darnold has this year. But it absolutely makes Dak Prescott tough to trust over the next couple of weeks. This is a little teaser for the 15 Transaction show, but Marquez Valdez-Scantling now has seen at least a 20% target share in the Packers offense in 3 of his last 4 games. And he's given us 2 top 10 performances during this stretch. Now, I've talked about MVS on previous 15 Transaction shows, but he continues to have the right boom or bust profile that underdogs can take advantage of in the fantasy playoffs. Chase Claypool has now failed to hit a target share north of 10% in 2 of his last 3. And according to Pro Football Focus, over this 3-game stretch, he's run 21 fewer routes than Ray McLeod. He ran fewer routes than McLeod in each one of those games. Claypool has a lot of talent. It just hasn't come together between the ears yet. I would have a hard time putting him in my fantasy lineup moving forward. A huge winner in Week 15 was Devin Singletary. He's now been a top 15 running back in back-to-back weeks. But in Week 15, he handled 95.7% of Buffalo's running back rushes. That was by far a season high, not just for him, but for any Buffalo running back. The previous high came from Singletary in week 1, where he had a 73% running back rush share. This backfield has been a mess for the majority of the season, but it does look like the Bills may be riding Singletary to the finish line. He's definitely someone worth rostering and potentially starting moving forward, especially with Buffalo getting Atlanta in week 17. We should probably talk about the Arizona Cardinals backfield because Chase Edmonds is back. He played this past week. The Cardinals weren't productive offensively, but we still got some information on the backfield split. Now keep in mind, James Conner was a little bit banged up this past week, and Edmonds is coming off an injury as well. But Conner saw 2 targets to Edmonds' 1 on Sunday, and he also ran 3 more routes than Edmonds did. This is definitely a change versus what we had seen before Edmonds' injury. From weeks 1 through 8, according to PFF, Edmonds had 180 routes run versus Conner's 75. It's a small sample size, but this is a show about trends. And right now, things are trending in the right direction for Conner in this split backfield. Things aren't nearly as good as they were without Edmonds, but if Conner keeps a receiving workload, he should still be very usable. Trend 7 is about the Green Bay backfield. Things flip-flop from week 14 to 15. In week 14, A.J. Dillon played 6 more snaps than Aaron Jones, and he carried the ball 15 times to Jones's 5. In week 15, Jones played 16 more snaps than Dillon, and he carried the ball 13 times to Dillon's 7. Jones also saw more targets in both games. They're definitely dividing up that backfield, but Jones still looks like the player that you'd want most on your fantasy roster. He's got more stability as a pass catcher, and the gap in snaps this week was more dramatic than last week. I'd assume the Packers want to use Dillon to grind things out in a super positive script, but in order to get to that point, Jones will still be involved. San Francisco has now given a running back 15 or more carries on 10 separate occasions this year. And for the record, this doesn't include any Deebo Samuel stats. I'm talking about players whose positions are listed as running back. But they've had 10 instances where a running back has had 15 or more carries. Since they've played 14 games, that's a rate of 71.4% of their games with a back having that number of carries. During Kyle Shanahan's time as 49ers head coach before this season, that rate has been under 47%. Now, on top of that, if you look at 20-plus attempt games, after Jeff Wilson's week 15, the 49ers now have 4 instances where a running back hit 20 or more carries in a game this year. From 2017 through 2020, so since Kyle Shanahan got to San Francisco, that's happened 6 total times. I don't know if this signals a meaningful change with how Kyle Shanahan might handle his team's backfield moving forward, because some or a lot of this may have to do with the availability of the running backs, but it's at least something to monitor and think about over the offseason. Mark Andrews is absolutely crushing it right now. He's been a top 5 tight end in weekly scoring in 5 of his last 6 games, averaging over 20 PPR points per game during this stretch. One of the things that I found interesting was just how consistent his workload has been this year. On the season, his lowest target share is 17.1% in a single game. That's the highest in the league at tight end by 2 percentage points over Travis Kelce. And then there's another 2 percentage point drop going to Darren Waller, whose lowest is 13%. Only 4 wide receivers at the time of this recording have had a higher minimum target share this season than Mark Andrews. The fact that Baltimore has thrown the ball a little bit more this year, that's what's helped Mark Andrews become a monster. The last trend this week is about James Robinson. Urban Meyer is gone. And what do you know? James Robinson had his best running back rush share and target share combination of the season. That's what happened in week 15. Against the Texans, Robinson saw 95% of Jacksonville's rushes, the 3rd highest of his season. He also saw 16.7% target share, the 2nd highest of his season. The combination of those 2 numbers hadn't been hit by Robinson all year long. With the Jets as their opponent in week 16, Robinson is back to being an RB1. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Once again, I'll have the 15 transactions episode for you tomorrow. I'll talk to you then.